Let me tell people who Joshua Katz is, by the way. He's a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He focuses on higher education, language, culture, the classic tradition, and the humanities broadly defined. A linguist by training, a classicist by profession, and a comparative philologist at heart, Dr. Katz has written widely on the languages, literature, cultures of the ancient, medieval, and modern world. In addition to 2 co-edited books and many dozens of articles and reviews on classics, linguistics, this is a very dedicated academician. He was a professor at Princeton University. In fact, he was the Coates Professor in Humanities, Professor of Classics, and a faculty associate of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions, and a tenured professor. So this is a very accomplished individual. He holds a BA in linguistics from Yale, University of Oxford, Harvard. He's just a highly educated, distinguished professor and academician. You've been married to him for about a year. How did y'all meet?
When I was a junior in high school applying for college, I sat in on classes at a bunch of different universities, including Princeton. And I had been introduced to Joshua by another professor at Princeton, and I was told, you have to take a class with Joshua Katz. He's the best teacher there. So I sat in on a class, and it was mesmerizing. I had never seen a classroom like his, and the students just adored him. And I basically decided I wanted to go to Princeton after sitting in on that class. I was then his student. I took a freshman seminar in Egyptology and hieroglyphs with him, and I took a course on the Greek poet Hesiod during my junior year at Princeton with him. But there was absolutely nothing romantic between us when I was a student. Then I graduated, and things eventually changed between us. He was on sabbatical in the UK while I was doing an MPhil in the UK. And yeah, things changed between us, and here we are married today.
At this point, he is no longer a professor at Princeton University. Tell us that story.
Right. So this is a long, complicated story. In a sense, it begins July 4th, 2020. And you'll remember what the world was like the summer of 2020. There was a lot of unrest and confusion and reckoning going on. And among the things going on was demand letters being issued by students and faculty at universities around the country.
This was after George Floyd.
Exactly, after George Floyd. And the students at Princeton had issued a long list of demands to the university in the name of anti-racism. And shortly thereafter, the faculty members at Princeton issued a long list of demands in the name of anti-racism. These demands were signed by hundreds of Joshua's colleagues. Joshua couldn't really believe that his colleagues had signed on to a letter that looked like this. So on July 8th, 2020, he wrote a response, and he called it his own Declaration of Independence. And he said that he agreed with some of their demands, such as summer move-in allowances for new faculty members, rewarding service done by faculty members, and the expansion of an undergraduate fellowship program for that specifically encouraged underrepresented minorities to pursue PhDs. But then he vociferously disagreed with others of their demands, thinking that some were immoral or discriminatory. Some were even in violation of the Title VII. And those were things like additional pay and perks for faculty of color, or creating a group that could investigate racist research and publication by faculty members. And so he disagreed strongly with those particular demands, while also, and he thought in a pretty mild-mannered way, saying some of these things were good and some of them were bad. Now, we are pretty certain that this would have caused a firestorm no matter what. But the real touch point was the fact that he referred to a long-defunct student group called the Black Justice League as a small local terrorist organization that made life miserable for the many, including the many Black students who disagreed with its demands. That particular phrase was picked up. The media went crazy. Twitter went crazy. Students at Princeton went crazy. Again, it's important to remember he was not talking about current students. He was talking about alumni several years out of college at this point who had been members of this group that used to go around targeting and harassing students on campus, and especially Black students who disagreed with them. But that line, as I say, people picked up, they attacked him, and overnight, Joshua went from the most popular professor at Princeton to a pariah. And it really was overnight. And as I said, when I arrived at Princeton, everybody said, you have to take a class with Joshua Katz. He's the most legendary professor here. And overnight, nobody would speak to him. And thus began the long saga that has been the last 2 years for us. Within days, his colleagues had issued letters denouncing him. They had posted statements, official statements on the official classics department website. The president of Princeton personally denounced Joshua's characterization of the Black Justice League. And his friends stopped speaking to him. And then meanwhile, unbeknownst to us, student reporters at the Daily Princetonian began digging into his personal life. And this was literally days within all of this happening. And they uncovered the fact that he'd had a consensual relationship with a student in the mid-2000s, so over 15 years ago. After 8 months of doing their investigative reporting, they published an article in February of 2021. And this, of course, reignited the firestorm with everyone calling for Joshua's head. The university said that Joshua had to issue a statement in response to the article, or they would issue one for him. And the gist of the statement that he ended up issuing was that, yes, he had a consensual relationship in the mid-2000s, and he'd already been punished for it, which is true. This was a relationship that had been brought to the attention of the university in the fall of 2017, and he had immediately confessed to it, had been sentenced to a year-long suspension, had taken the year-long suspension without hesitation. But that didn't matter, to many at Princeton and academia. They said, well, a year-long suspension isn't sufficient. And so eventually a second investigation was launched. And the result of that, at the end of this long 2-year saga, was that Joshua was fired at the end of this last school year.
Okay, well, let me ask a few questions here. In 2006, he had a consensual relationship with a student.
Correct.
And this was reported in fall of 2017.
Correct.
It was investigated, and he was given a 1-year suspension without pay.
That is correct.
And then he was reinstated in the academic year 2019.
Correct.
Okay, so this happened in 2006. 11 years later, it came to the university's attention. They adjudicated this, gave him a year suspension without pay, then apparently determined that he was not a threat to students and returned him to the classroom.
Absolutely.
Okay. And so in 2019, 2020, 2021, he resumed his teaching.
That's correct. Although he was, while the second investigation was going on, he was placed on paid administrative leave. So he was not teaching during the 2021 school year. But in 2019 and 2020, he was teaching.
19 and 20, he was teaching. Okay.
Yeah.
Then he made the statements in an article, A Declaration for Independence by a Princeton professor.
Yeah.
And he did that in 2020.
Correct.
And that's when all hell broke loose.
Correct.
So they started investigating a complaint that had already been adjudicated.
That is correct. That's what we call double jeopardy.
Be that as it may, this is a university policy.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't a Title IX violation.
That's
it wasn't
correct.
a criminal violation.
Correct.
So no criminality here, no Title IX here.
Nope. And no one has ever accused him of harassment or anything like that. It's entirely, this all comes down to a consensual relationship with an undergraduate at a time when, I should say, consensual relationships with undergraduates were permitted unless the student was your student at that time. And in this case, the student was his student.
All right. So he didn't object, he didn't appeal, he didn't resist. And so what he wrote at the time had to do with this petition to do these certain things with Black faculty members, correct?
Yes, exactly.
And he voiced his opinion. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's fair. And he referred to them as a small local terrorist organization.
So he was referring to a group of alumni that was separate from the people who wrote the letter.
Right. He was referring to this small group of alumni. He said they created problems for students, and he said it was picked up when President Eisgruber wrote his letter. He, in fact, quoted that, but he didn't include the entire quote, as I understand. He took out the part about also created a lot of problems for Black students.